Hi, I'm John Atack, and this is my friend Alex Stein. I think I pronounced your surname correctly, did I?
You're one of the only people ever to talk to me on, interview kind of thing who has. So well done.
Well, it's because you told me about it.
Yeah.
And you were involved with a small socialist cult was it in Minnesota in the US somewhere?
It was in Minnesota, and we'll put socialist in big quotes because what it was a cult.
Yeah.
And actually, there's a potentially interesting backstory there, which, if we have time, we maybe can talk about that I only briefly touch on in my first book, where I tell that story.
And that's Inside Out.
That's Inside Out.
Which is a very fine autobiography, if I may say so.
Thank you. I'm very proud of it.
I would think it's very well written.
Thank you. And I that was part of getting myself back to myself after I got out, because I had always wanted to be a writer and I'd always written. And of course, for 10 years in a cult, the only thing I wrote were memos to my contact, etc., and procedures. They were big on writing procedures. Anyway, so getting out of the cult and finding my writing voice again was very, very wonderful.
And how long ago did you leave the group?
Well, it's 30 years now. Yeah, been a while.
Time passes, doesn't it? It's what, 37 years since I left Scientology. And
so I had 10 years in, and 30 years out. So yeah, it's a big experience.
And I mean, your background is really quite fascinating because you were born in South Africa. Your parents moved to England, relatively well-to-do, but
well, we weren't really then. We were sort of we were more like the kind of intellectual communist bohemian lot. So when we came from, my mum was English actually, so she was a Londoner, and they didn't come, either of them, from well-to-do backgrounds. I mean, educated.
Yeah.
And when we came back from South Africa in '58, because of this apartheid that was so vicious, and all my parents' friends were getting banged up for, life prison terms, and they were somewhat involved in the anti-apartheid struggle, so it was time to go, as they had 4 children and they could leave and come back here. And they were, my dad had trouble getting a job when he came. He had been a journalist in South Africa and he couldn't get into the union. It was a closed shop back in those days. So it was kind of, at the beginning, I remember, not having money. And then later, he got a good business going. He was a sort of pioneer in direct marketing, actually, and all those dreadful mailings we now get from everywhere. And eventually did make money and lost it, because he later had a wee gambling problem, so I'm led to understand. Anyway, so it was kind of up and down thing, and a weird class position, actually, where one never, we didn't quite ever fit in, other than in the kind of arts. So the pictures you see behind me, we had a lot of artist friends. They painted those. I've sort of inherited them now. So there was a lot of artists and musicians and political people on the left that we grew up with.
You grew up in I have the sense of your childhood from your description of the house you lived in when you were a teenager.
Yeah.
And that I think you left when you were 16, you went to Paris or
15.
something? 15.
Yeah, I ran away with a very handsome Frenchman.
Oh,
so, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
That's a story I haven't written yet, but I'm thinking about. Right after 68, so it was an exciting time. Anyway, yes, I've got endless stories once you get me going.
And I mean, what I took away from it is that your parents were socially aware. They were people who are concerned about other people, and as I believe we all should be. And so you grew up in an environment of protest against the Vietnam War, protest against apartheid, and oppression in general. And that was a theme that that continued, and you know, you devoted your life, as a youngster, to trying to change the world, trying to make the world a better place.
Yeah, totally. You know, and I went at the age of 18, I went to California, and yeah, that was at that time, the early 70s, a kind of hotbed of all kinds of really actually a lot of positive and rich efforts to do collective projects, and just a lot. It was kind of an interesting and good time. And yeah, that was my culture. That was a culture I came from, was, you know, social justice. And that's still my culture. You know, that's actually why I do the work I do now around cults, because to me that is intimately connected, because cults oppress people. The same way apartheid oppressed Black people, cults oppress their members, and often people outside as well. So, you know, that has been a constant thread. Interestingly, the time that I never did any work that was to do with social justice was when I was in the supposed left-wing cult, because basically, and therein lies a long story, because my hypothesis is that actually it was I don't know if it was the FBI or one of these kind of undercover and at arm's length from the government, but connected to the government operations, to split and kind of neuter the left in Minneapolis and St. Paul, where there was a very, very active progressive movement. And this guy came in, formed this cult, completely split the left, and sort of destroyed it for many, many years. That was the effect. So I'm always asking the question, why did he do that? Well, I think there was probably a reason. Anyway, just
on that point, I recently saw a piece called Panthers 21 about the Panthers 21 trial. And we've had the Chicago 7 with Ali G in it recently, which I thought was very well made and terrifying to realize what was happening in the US at that time. And that with the Panthers 21, that eventually the only defendant who doesn't have a lawyer starts asking one of the three informers who are in the group on the witness stand where all the plans to blow things up came from. And they said, well, the FBI who employed us. So every nasty thing they were meant to be doing. And the case fell apart. She was Tupac Shakur's mother, Alifa, I think, Shakur.
And we've got our own British version here with the Spy Cops scandal. The same thing. So I don't have full proof, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that my cult was an operation run for that purpose.
Yeah.
And hence we didn't do anything political, because other left-wing political cults, like the one Janja Lalich was in, the Democratic Workers' Party, which was in San Francisco and the Bay Area, they at least did some political things. You know, they were a horrible cult. I'm not saying they, but they at least had a kind of political presence. And except for the very beginning of my group, the group I was in, really, we rather quickly went underground, sort of disappeared, and, baked bread and wrote computer programs and did very shoddy construction. So, why was that going on? Anyway, long story, but it is interesting because you can, and I guess the one, I often don't talk about it because it makes it too complicated to tell the story and then bring in the politics. But given what's happening now, for instance, the January 6th insurrection in the US and in the Black Lives Matter movement, where we're clearly seeing this far-right forces posing as left or progressive.
Provocateur, yeah.
They're provocateurs. And I think our guy was too. That I think I do need to start talking about it more, because this is not unusual. It's a key part of the methodology of the far right. So, yeah. So that takes some coming to terms with when you get out of something after 10 years, that you realize everything that was, well, not everything, but things that were a very good part of myself that I value were turned around against me, which is a lot of what people coming out of cults feel, isn't it? I mean, that's fairly universal, I think.
I mean, I started using the word authoritarian group because although I'm told that Eileen Barker does now use the word cult.
Doesn't believe they exist, so that's an interesting concept. Yeah.
But I mean, I put it to her at Manchester that, you know, if people want to call them new religious movements, even though they're not new, because, you know, according to the Britannica, new means after 1830. According to Eileen Barker, it means after the Second World War. For me, it means something a bit more recent than that, new. Religious, well, all of the therapy cults and the emotion, all of that. Yeah, it's like
wasn't religious.
Not religious at all.
But you know, I've had those conversations with some of these folks, and they say, "Well, you know, communism is like a religion." I'm like, "No, it's not. It's atheist. It's not like a religion. You can't." Then language stops having any meaning at all at that point.
Absolutely. And I mean, but the point I put to her was if you want to call them new religious movements, that's fine. Can we now make a category that's destructive new religious movements? And she went, because she could see I was recording the lecture. But I moved towards this idea that what it was I didn't like about these groups is that they're authoritarian, they're bullying, that you've got somebody who thinks they should be the boss, and you've got a lot of people who think they've got to do what the boss tells them. And for me, that's the essential problem in our society. If we could shift that, we could have democracy. And until we do, we're going to have this weird situation where people like Bolsonaro, Duterte, Abe, Putin, Xi, Donald Trump, Scott Morrison are elected because of all the manipulation and the PR, and because people don't know how to differentiate facts from fiction. It's not taught in our schools, and they don't recognize predators, people who quite clearly are unpleasant, like Duterte, the man who says his only crime is the judicial killings. So murder is the only crime he's committed.
Well, people also don't understand, and this is something, you know, I've worked a bit with the Radicalization Awareness Network that I've tried to share with them, because there's a lot of talk about, you know, teaching critical thinking, and of course that's important. But what we also need to teach is how these groups and these processes disable critical thinking.
Yes.
Because I think I was a critical thinker.
I certainly was.
Yeah, as much as a 26-year-old can be, you know. But that thinking was switched off, which is why we talk about brainwashing, because it is something that is happening in your brain that is making you, in regard to the experience of the relationship that is doing that to you, makes you stupid. It makes you unable to think about it. And it's too scary to think about. And I just want to say one thing about the authority. I mean, I certainly don't want to get into a semantic discussion, because you know how those go.
Yeah.
But just the thing, and I agree, of course, that these are authoritarian groups, but I think we do have to add the element, I suppose, that we usually talk about as charisma, which I'm sure you do include in that, because Hannah Arendt has what I think is a very useful distinction between totalitarianism and a dictatorship. And she talks about, you know, dictatorships being where the rule is by simple violence alone. You know, you step out of line, you're going to get thrown out of a helicopter over the, you know, whatever that sea is. Which, anyway. But the groups we're concerned with want you to become a willing victim. And I'm quoting Arendt here, and also Judith Herman, both fantastic thinkers in this field. And that's, you know, they do that by disabling your ability to think, and by disabling your ability to have relationships rich, trusting relationships with anyone, really. So yes, I just want to make that distinction between, I mean, of course, the authoritarian groups also use force and violence, though not all of them, but I think most of them do at some point use some kind of violence, at least the threat of it. But it's, as you know,
differentiate the authoritarian from the totalitarian, and we were many of us in this field using the word totalist or totalitarian. Indeed, in the first edition of Opening Minds, which is now coming out as Opening Our Minds, in the fourth edition now. But in the first edition, I used the word totalist.
Yeah.
And Lifton had used it, and
I like that word. Yeah.
But a totalist is, of course, a total authoritarian. That's all the word means, because that was how it was constructed when it was first used. And
I always thought it meant a totalist environment, that that closed environment, that bubble. But anyway, I don't know. I don't remember. But that's,
as you say, we can get into semantics. But my understanding is that the word totalitarian was first used in the 1920s to describe Mussolini, because he had total authority, and that was then abbreviated to totalist in the 40s. But there's a statement. I was watching a Tom Stoppard play called Professional Foul, and in it, Peter Barkworth, who's one of the characters, says you can persuade a man to believe almost anything, provided he's clever enough. And they're talking about the Soviet system, the USSR's system in Czechoslovakia at the time. The play is set in Czechoslovakia, as was. And it's something that I've noticed along the way, that highly intelligent people can use their intellect to buttress their stupidity. And so what happens to the critical thinking within that is that it shifts towards defending our friend Yuval Law says that the cult member regards the doctrine as a mother regards a baby. So the doctrine may not be criticized, that there's this, you mustn't ever say, my baby's not ugly, just happens to look like Winston Churchill, there is that kind of element. And so that what happens, what I see a lot of, in having talked now with thousands of former members, is tremendously empathetic people like yourself, people who care about others, who've been pulled into a sinister system that has then weaponized them, the weaponized empath, and taken their ideals and said, well, we can only achieve a perfect world by killing these people or what have you.
Well, so, by you being totally obedient, importantly.
Yeah. And obedience is that central notion of authority, and that one will submit to authority. And what we'd like is for people to have the critical thinking so they can think their way out of things, but to also understand the attachment, the emotional commitment that we make, and the way that we make that commitment, whether it's through a peak experience or a piece of magic.
Well, and I look at this as that these are fear-based systems. At the core of all of them is a fear response. So the recruitment process often may have these elements of charisma and peak experience and love bombing. Not my group didn't have any of those, by the way, but it did have this promise of, if you were a good soldier, the revolution would come. Or at least your role in it would be pushing the revolution forward. So at the beginning, you have to have something to draw people in, and it's usually something that is already in the realm of that person's thinking. Not always, but Loughlin is really good on this in that book Doomsday Cult, where he's very good on the 7 steps of recruitment, which I probably won't remember right now. But it's a marvelous opposite to Eileen Barker's ridiculous piece on the Moonies. But it's a study of the Moonies, their early outpost in the Bay Area, I think it was, and he and a fellow graduate student kind of infiltrated until they couldn't infiltrate further, because, as you know, there's a point you can't carry on. But anyway, so, there's the recruitment, which has to involve these pieces of positive experience or things that relate to what you think your goals are at the time, or so forth. Of course, we have to remember not everyone's recruited. We have this whole these generations of people born into these systems or raised.
I was walking. I wasn't recruited by anybody.
And I was kind of like that. I kind of knocked rather hard on the door of this organization and said, please let me in. Because I knew someone who had been in it, and this is all in my book. So yeah, I wasn't, I was wanting to get involved. So you have to have that piece, but I think soon the fear messages start. Once you're kind of in their zone, and they've started to isolate you from your previous zone of relationships. So now you're, most of your friends, most of your time is in this group, and you start getting these fear messages. The end of the world is coming. If you don't confess everything to us, you'll go to hell. If you don't show up on time, you're going to get disciplined. In my group, if you did a mistake like be late, you had to write a self-criticism form about what was your ideological problem that meant you didn't foresee all the circumstances that meant you were going to be late, and head them off ahead of time, absurd things. And, so whether it's fear messages about the outside world, that they're going to come after us, or they're satanic, or all of those things. They're suppressives, they're worldlies, all that language.
Untermensch.
And we're the good ones, but even the good ones, what's your original sin? What's in my group, your bourgeois or petty bourgeois ideology, or whatever it was. So not only are you frightened of the outside world, you're also taught in a funny way to be alienated from yourself, because you have to transform because you're fundamentally flawed. And you have these weird relationships inside the group where you can't actually trust the other people. You're sort of close with them in this weird way. As Hannah Arendt again says, you're pressed tightly together with them, where you all have to be the same. Hence, you can't say I'm different, or I think differently about this, because if you do, you might get turned in, and then you're going to have to be in the hot seat and get criticized. So all of these forces are going on, which are basically fear-based. And what I'm trying to look at, what I've looked at in my work, in my PhD work, and then further in my 2 editions of my book, Terror, Love, and Brainwashing, is what does this fear do? And the beauty of attachment theory is it really explains this. Or it's one explanation. There's, many other ways of looking at this, but I think this is one really useful one. Because when, we've evolved as humans, or as mammals, really, when we're frightened, to seek out protection from an attachment figure. And that's sort of obvious with babies and parents, right? If they don't do that, and if the parent doesn't reciprocate, the baby won't survive for long. But this evolved seeking a protection from a close other persists in adulthood. We kind of know this, right? And that's, been really difficult in the pandemic, because it's been harder to seek out our close others while we're in this terrible crisis. So we've got all this fear about the pandemic and fewer resources to seek out our protection figures, even if symbolic, isn't that? Anyway, so in a cult, I think they make use of that by frightening us, cutting off our usual protection figures, our prior friends and family, and positioning the cult as the safe place, so therefore the place we should go to seek protection. But because it's the cult that's frightening us in the first place, it's maladaptive, and it creates a positive feedback loop where we're trying to get comfort from the source of fear. In that sense, it's exactly like a controlling domestic violence relationship,
which is a disorganized attachment, which
yeah,
you perhaps explain for us.
Yeah, so that's in attachment theory, that relationship of trying to get comfort from a frightening of figure creates disorganized attachment. And I think another word that I've been using more recently, because I think it's more intuitive, it forms a trauma bond. Yeah. So you're bonding to the source of trauma. And you're not bonding to it because you want to. You're not like, because like people want to say, oh, you're somehow masochistic or whatever, you're seeking out these dangerous and ugly relationships. No, you're doing that because the cult has isolated you from any alternate possible really properly safe relationships. And this is universal in cults, this isolation, absolutely fundamental to how this dynamic works. So then they frighten you, and they say they're the good ones, so you go trying to get protection. They might give you little drips of it, what Judith Herman calls the something granting of small indulgences. So kind of random, it's occasional, just to keep you, like there might be some good here, but meanwhile, mostly what you're getting is terror.
And what we see in a child, a disorganized attachment, is where they have a parent who is their source of protection and who'll sort of go, come here, I love you, and then hit them. That they, it's not a secure attachment.
So what you see in those kids, when the early studies they did where they kind of discovered this, is when the parent comes having been separated in the experimental condition, the parent returns, the kid, instead of kind of either going to hug in some way, which would be secure attachment, there's other forms that I won't go into, but the disorganized form, the kid does all these weird movements. They called them anomalous movements because they couldn't work out why the kids were doing this. And they would kind of go, or they would go towards the parent and then back. So they were physically showing this. They didn't know whether to approach or avoid. And they got kind of stuck in that. And that's the freeze response. So we have fight, flight, and freeze, right? And that's a kind of freeze response. There's no useful action you can do to protect yourself.
No, you're paralyzed.
Yeah, you're paralyzed. And my feeling is that that's what's happening in a cult once you're all the way in it. You're getting these fear messages. You think the cult's a good place. You go to it, but it's frightening. And you don't know what to do. So your mind blanks out, which is what happens in freeze. It's a cognitive freeze. And you just kind of go, cannot compute. Everyone's telling me this is good, including all the other cult members around with the pluralistic ignorance phenomenon. Everyone else is feeling like you're feeling, but no one's talking about it because you're not allowed to. So you get this immense social pressure. You're being told this is heaven on earth. And it doesn't compute with your reality. And that's that you were talking about the difference between fact and fiction. The fact of cult life is pretty damn miserable. And I always think it's pretty damn boring. But the fictional account, which is the cult ideology that they're feeding you, is, this is the best thing since sliced bread, we're the greatest and all the rest of it. And so you kind of, in the freeze, you just take that in and you go, well, I know this is good. And then you can't think because there's nothing validating your real physical experience. And I won't go into it all, but this is happening at a physiological level with your, excitatory hormones and your calming hormones. And you can read my my pieces on the internet or my book and learn more about that if you wish. But it's very much a physical, physiological process, I think, which then gets this layer of the doctrine that then people have to spout and try to use to try to justify what's happening. And then if you're lucky enough to get out, and people, as we know, get out in very different ways and take very, very different paths. For myself, and I suspect you, John, but tell me, some of us get out and we have that rather instant falling of the scales fall from our eyes. And I know for me, as soon as I had someone in the cult who validated verbally to me that there were some power problems, is how she put it, it was sort of instant. I mean, not all my understanding, but my thinking clicked back in. It's like, what the hell is going on here? I'm going to get out. And it took another 3 months to get out because it's hard to get out of a cult. You know, it's not a trivial thing.
It's like leaving a family. You know, you've become a member of this family, and now, unlike an ordinary decent family, if you move away, they're not going to talk to you again. You know, you're abandoned. So it is.
And they made an issue, which, you know, the cult certainly tried to do to me by attempting to take my children. I had 2 young children, to take them away from me. You know, so there are often very serious consequences. Plus, you are carrying this fear, this instilled fear over however many years you've been in, which is nameless. It's kind of by definition nameless because it's just part of the mechanism of control. So to leave, you kind of have to break through this fear barrier that you can't identify, that you haven't got a language for. And it's sort of a leap of faith or loss of faith, a leap of loss of faith. And, you know, that was very, very frightening, I remember. And I think a lot of people experience leaving a cult. It's very frightening. You think that they're going to come after you, which of course Scientology does.
Has been known.
You think you may be losing your home, your children, your job, you know, all these things that have become entangled with the group. And you have this name, and how are you going to survive on the outside? And this nameless fear. And the whole thing is dreadful. So, you know, it takes a lot of guts to leave a cult.
Yeah, I mean, people will, we talk routinely about phobia induction. We talk about guilt induction, which can lead to shame, just a sense of being a bad person. And there are religious roots to that sinfulness. And in the, you know, Mao gave us self-criticism as a method of absolutely devastating the human mind, and taking the family values of Confucianism and making the party the family. That's the simple way I see it in the transformation he created. So that, you know, it's like Angkor, the notion among the Cambodians, this idea of we're now starting again, and the demand for purity, which Lifton talks about. We have to be pure, and to be pure, we have to be these things. And as you said before, I think perhaps certainly one of the most significant things that happens in a cult group is that you become an enemy to yourself, which you pretty much said before, the enemy within. And I think this is a dangerous aspect of not simply religious, spiritual, political thinking. It's a dangerous aspect of psychological thinking, that many people believe they have an unconscious mind. Now, while we do have unconscious behaviors, there isn't a little control center invisible within us that's dictating what we ought to do. And that idea is found in Freud's work. It's found in Jung's work, through the analytic movement.
Yeah, what I like about attachment theory, which was developed initially by John Bowlby, and he developed it really as a kind of, he commented that he was less interested in what Freud was, the nighttime nightmares or dreams. I can't quite remember the quote. He was interested in the daytime nightmares, what was actually happening to people. And so I think that very much is what you're talking about. It's, although he also talked about how with disorganized attachment, it can create what he terms segregated systems, which is that one part of your memory, the kind of trauma, the emotion center of your brain keeps trauma memories in this segregated area that doesn't get metabolized. So like I can talk now with you about the cult trying to take my kids away because I've written about it. I've talked many, many times about it. I'm not firing all my emotion memories. Now, I could go back there if I wanted. No, thank you. But early on, to talk about that, I when I would recount my story, I would, that's just, I was just modeling dissociation there for those who didn't get it. I wasn't actually doing, I would suddenly be, as they say in attachment theory, absorbed back into the memory, and just lose track of my surroundings because it was a trauma memory, because it hadn't been, in a way, the simplest way to think about it, I hadn't really talked about it enough to store it in my frontal cortex where I can access it, but it hasn't got the emotional valence of the trauma memories that tend to get stuck in the midbrain. And so if you don't process those trauma memories, Bowlby said the danger is they leak out at perhaps inappropriate times. And I think when people talk about being triggered in the original sense of the word, not the kind of current nonsense, it's something happens, a smell or a comment, and you're suddenly back there in that trauma because it's leaked out into your current life because it hasn't been processed and stored in this more neutral frontal cortex. So, it's a very different view of psychology than the kind of classical Freudian view.
And Bowlby, of course, broke away from Freudian ideas in the 50s himself.
Did, yeah.
He was looking for a different way of expressing transference and countertransference that would be a bit more useful.
Well, I don't even know if he used those terms. I think he kind of got way past that kind of terminology.
But that's where he started as a Freudian analyst.
Yes, yeah, well, that was his training, yeah.
Those things and saying, well, this isn't working. This doesn't take us to a place. And you then had the studies of children, the first studies of children in hospitals who'd been separated from their parents. But he did a lot of work afterwards. And then, of course, Mary Ainsworth chipped in a fair amount too.
He's an amazing guy who's contributed so much, and there's been so much useful work done based on his work. So yeah.
I mean, I find it very surprising that kids in school are still not taught any of the real basics of psychology. So the thought that cognitive dissonance has been experimented upon somewhere over 10,000 times to say, well, yes, if we believe something strongly, then evidence against it will make us believe it more strongly. That seems to me a simple idea. It's been with us since, I think, 1953, Festinger first mentioned it. And it still isn't something that kids are taught in school. There is so much else, including work on attachment.
Well, and of course, the classics, the Ash Lines experiment and Milgram and Sheriff, the basic classic social psychology that got kind of forgotten about. And, when I teach this stuff, I go right back to those classics. And there's always people who say, well, this, can they replicate this? And no, these experiments were false and they didn't really work. Well, first of all, they've been replicated, as you say, many, many times in many different scenarios. And then I like to remind people of why most of those studies were done. It wasn't because these social scientists were just bored and, thought thought this will be fun. It's because they were trying to understand what happened in the Holocaust and how could people have done these things to other human beings. So I like to remind people that there was a great natural experiment with very terrible consequences. And that's why those social psychologists did the work they did. They weren't, that's the direction of scholarship. So we have to take those studies seriously. And I agree. I think, if I could design a prevention education program, I would start at 5 years old teaching about bullying. And actually, I wouldn't. I would start with the universities because we have to train the trainers. And I would start with, teaching about totalitarianism as they do in Germany, but that seems to be the only country where that's systematically done. For obvious reasons, they were early at that. And I would teach the basic social psychology. And, I would teach about, you mentioned Cambodia, I teach that when I give my course. And by the way, The Killing Fields is a very good film if you want to learn something in an easily digestible way about Cambodia.
A good book too. The journalist it was about wrote a book, and then you have Swimming to Cambodia by Spalding Gray, which is a great work of art.
And there's a fantastic film. Unfortunately, you probably have to get it through a university library, unfortunately, called The Flute Player, that's about a Cambodian who was a child soldier in the Khmer Rouge.
Yeah.
And I usually end my courses with that film, which leaves everybody in tears. But it's got a very hopeful, it is a traumatizing film, but it also is one that shows how people can overcome trauma. Not totally overcome, because you always have it, but then try to move forward and do something positive. And this guy that the film is about is just an amazing, amazing fellow. Who, of course, An Chon Pond is his name, and it's worth looking him up on. There's a couple of shorter versions on YouTube, not of that film, but little pieces about him. Just an amazing guy.
I'll see if I can find it. I mean, and I've recently seen The Mauritanian, about a man who spent 14 years in Guantanamo Bay before being released without charges. And they point out that 779 detainees have been taken there. 8 of them have been convicted of a crime. 3 of those, the conviction was overturned. So only 5 people out of 779. What particularly surprised me with the Mauritanian, the guy it's about was there was a BBC documentary about him a few weeks ago. And it was that he'd actually been in this dreadful place for 14 years. And yet he seemed to have no resentment whatsoever as a consequence. That we talk about the concept of resilience, that a small amount of people, perhaps 15% of people, it doesn't seem to matter what you do to them, they don't get post-traumatic stress disorder. They manage to survive. But it doesn't mean that they don't get post-traumatic stress. We're all of us triggered sometimes by environments, by the reminder of, what's happened to us. For most people who've been in a cult, it's a reminder of the cult. That's not true for me. I had a very pleasant time. I seem to be the only person who did.
Well, talking about how to teach, this stuff, which, I've done several courses. It's sort of the same material, but I've taught it for many years. And I guess my main thing is it's very teachable. People find it fascinating. They find it immediately useful. They start spotting these kind of coercive persuasion attempts that day. Many of them discover their families or themselves have been in a cult when you give them a language to describe these strange experiences. And I find it very rewarding, but I'm not doing it right now. Anyway, that's another story, whether I'll be able to get a course online or not. But it's very teachable, and really, governments should be mandating this, but then governments don't always want to do what's best for democracy, as we know, especially a lot of the current governments.
Well, I remember the New Labour campaign in '97, and having spent by that time 13 or 14 years looking at coercive control, I was shocked by the way the campaign was staged. And of course, later Philip Gould and Derek Draper and Alistair Campbell, many of these spin doctors who'd created the campaign, spoke up. And I think at that point, public trust completely collapsed in politicians because we saw the puppet masters. We saw, of course, Dominic Cummings has become the most celebrated of them all now. But this awful idea of telling people what they want to hear and making sure that the news feed is pure, rather than actually doing something decent and good in the world. And the short-termism, the let's get elected in 4 years' time.
And the lies. I mean, I think what we're seeing now that's so very dangerous, we clearly saw that in the US and we're seeing it here now. The blatant and consistent lying. And then when people attempt to hold the politicians who are lying to account, just denial. And then sadly, when the opposition isn't strongly pointing this stuff out, they just have free reign. And lying is a very, very dangerous tool, and it is a tool of totalitarianism, as I'm sure you know. Again, it's that fiction. You just tell people a fiction, and then they start to be unable to know. It's kind of like a form of societal-wide gaslighting, because then people can't figure out what their reality is anymore. And because we don't have so many social structures like unions or like more stable communities or even like pubs, and places for people to hang out, people are more isolated and they have less verification and validation of their own experiences. And
they fall into the echo chambers of the internet, only accessing those commentators who they already believe. So you get people like Alex Jones or Rush Limbaugh creating massive followings simply by spouting lies. I've long had this feeling about politicians. It actually went back to Margaret Thatcher in the Belgrano, that when she stood up in the House and said the Belgrano was in the exclusion zone, and she knew that wasn't true because she'd personally given the order to sink it.
About the Falkland,
that's right, during the Falklands.
That
was when it first came to my attention that a politician could go on the floor of the House in Parliament and lie. And I sort of went, I think we should suspend them from politics for a year, or if they do this, if we ever catch them out, whether on the floor of the House or representing an interest, a cabinet member, for example, I think in the same way that a solicitor or a lawyer, a barrister going into court, they are already on oath. What they say has to be the truth. They don't need, because of their profession and their certification. I think politicians should be truthful. And
as we know, they're not. And these norms that have operated, not necessarily brilliantly, but they have at least been there, are kind of just disappearing. And it's very scary. I wanted to say something here, and I think we'd talked before we started recording a bit about this. I've had a very unpleasant experience of seeing on, not a lot of it, but a little bit on Twitter and Facebook, a few people have been using my book, Terror, Love and Brainwashing, to justify the opposite of what I'm trying to say in that book. And they're coming from a position of kind of libertarianism leading to far-right thinking. And it's part of this kind of anti-PC, anti-political correctness, anti-woke. And I put that in quotes because, woke is a word that was used in the Black community to talk about people understanding their situation in life. And it has been completely co-opted by the right. And I personally resent that. And I particularly resent that people have been using my book, which is saying we need to, not be in cults. We need to think for ourselves, which I do believe. But they're kind of making that into a libertarian argument that, that this means we shouldn't have any kind of collective sense, or, society shouldn't exist. And, anything that I think or say is okay. It doesn't matter about the effect on anyone else. And I very strongly believe that we are part of society, and that society as such, we have an obligation, like with this pandemic. I understand some people don't want to get vaccinated, but I also feel like if you're a thinking person who actually cares about other people, it's important that our vaccinations or our masks or whatever it is that, protect others. We are part of a society. The pandemic doesn't care who you are and what your individual ideas are. This virus is going to use you to infect others and kill many of them, as we've seen. So this personal liberty thing, I really don't buy into. And my book isn't saying that. It's not at all. It's saying we need collectives where the collective cares about the collective and the individuals in it. Those are not opposite to each other. If we only care about individuals, we get libertarianism, which I'm really sorry, really quickly goes into far right fascist thinking, because then it's only about whoever can get to the top is worthy, and the rest of the people are just, dirt under your feet. And this is not what I subscribe to. And, if anyone's thinking of using my work in that way, please don't. And read a bit more carefully. And I may not be saying that in the most articulate way, but, I really subscribe to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which was a collectively created document by representatives of many nations. And it's really quite a beautiful document. And, it's about, we're in this together. We don't survive on our own. Doesn't mean the opposite of that is a cult. No, we need flexible and kind and open structures, which is the opposite of what a cult is.
And actually, just look at simply, there are social activities and there are antisocial activities. And there seems to have been this kind of perception among, say, sovereign citizens that they can become asocial. They can separate themselves out from everybody else. And yet on close investigation, they tend to use the roads to drive their cars on. And Steve Kent gave a very interesting paper in 2013 in Copenhagen on sovereign citizens. And you've moved into this absurd world where you don't have to contribute to society. Now, this is partly the fundamental political split between the Republicans and the Democrats, isn't it? That the Republicans head towards a libertarian view where it's your fault if something's happened to you. God doesn't like you or whatever the reason is, and you caught this disease. Whereas the Democrats believe you should at least have some welfare and some basic health. I mean, those positions hardened in the 1970s, but because certainly Abraham Lincoln as a Republican wasn't thinking that way. But that's why I like the word authoritarian, because you come to something that you can have a debate about what the word cult means. Factually, it means a group that favors a particular leader or doctrine. That's its traditional, conventional meaning, which started to change radically in the 1970s. That what we were then calling, or in the 80s calling, destructive cults, now the word cult itself was pejorative. And so I think
language is a living organism as much as anything else. So we are having a semantic discussion. I don't really care about all that history. The point is, it's a word that lay people understand. They have more or less an understanding of what that means. They can form a picture in their minds, which may not be a perfect picture. It certainly won't be, unless they've researched for years and, experienced it. But it's a word that has a current meaning. And the only reason there's a debate about it is because the apologists don't want to acknowledge that these groups that have funded them are problematic. That's the only reason there is this debate. And that's all I want to say about it, because it takes way too much time. Sorry, I'm being feisty, but it's their attempt to shut people like you and me up by taking language away. And
we have to be feisty.
I resist. I'm not going to have the language taken away. Thank you very much.
I think that if we get into the public relations aspect, we come to rebranding. This idea that we want to give people a new way of looking at things, and cults is a way of looking at things. But for me, one of the worst questions and the most frequently asked in the last 40 years has been somebody coming up to me and saying, my friend is involved in this group, is it a cult? Mm-hmm. And saying, well, here we are going to have to talk about something. Is it harmful to them? Is it dangerous to them? Is it estranging them from their relationships? That here we need to be careful because, for example, Rick Ross, in his book about cults, boasts in the foreword that he was flown by the Chinese government to mainland China to give his opinion as to whether Falun Gong is a cult. Now, I would say this is akin to going to Nazi Germany in the 1930s and saying that the Jews are a cult. The reason for that is that by the time he made this statement, Wikipedia was recording 4,500 executions of Falun Gong members in China. And so giving them any extra material, because if there is a cult in the world, then it's China. It's what's happened there, this fascist system, which is mistakenly called communism by some people.
The flaw in your argument, if I may, is that the Jews are not a cult. Falun Gong is a cult. I'm not saying one should give information to the Chinese government, which is also a cult, or it's a totalitarian state, but the Jews were not. I mean,
I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's like going to Germany at that time and giving the Germans more license to run Dachau and the camps. I'm not saying that Falun Gong is comparable in that way. I'm not going to get into the debate as to whether the many strands direction. Falun Gong has a basis in Taoist religion that goes back 2,500 years.
It's a cult.
It's nonsense, but
it's run by a cult leader. I mean, we can call it an authoritarian group if you want, but I think there's been plenty of evidence.
But you see that by what I'm saying is that by using that label, he gave a license to the Chinese government to keep on harvesting the organs of members of Falun Gong. And that's a point where...
I think that was the fault of the word. I'm sorry. I think we're getting into some very odd...
Well, I'm talking about the precision of words, and I'm coming down to, in fact, the word social and the word antisocial. But when we view a cult group from the point of view of, is it antisocial? From the point of view of, is it authoritarian?
Name me a non-destructive cult, other than the cult of the Beatles, or I'm showing my generation here.
What a long time ago that was. Well,
there's always discussion about
semantic on you because you didn't want to get semantic. The first shift of the word cult to mean anything negative was in the American Heritage Dictionary in the 1890s. Up to 1977, the Oxford Dictionary did not accept any pejorative meaning. So you could have the cult of flower arranging. You could have the cult of Winnie the Pooh.
Again, language is a living thing, and the cult certainly means the cult of Winnie the Pooh. I like that idea, and I would join that. But any English speaker would understand that is being used in a different sense. Words do not have a single meaning.
Sometimes they do.
Occasionally they do, but I just want people to go listen to Michael Rosen, because I'm a Orwellian and I'm a Michael Rosenite. I don't think he wants people to call him that. But, you know, it's a living organism that has, you know, we know the difference between the cult of Winnie the Pooh and the cult of Scientology. No one has to explain to us that those are different meanings. We use them in different contexts. And I'm saying, I don't care if we call it a cult or anything else. It's just that cult happens to be the current word that most people understand when you say, oh, you know, I lost my daughter to a cult. They understand what you're saying. They don't think she's reading Winnie the Pooh all the time. They think, well, there may be a Winnie the Pooh actual cult, but you know, they know that means the daughter is unavailable. She's been sucked into a group that's taking up all her energy, and that is not useful for her development as a person, and is being exploited. So that's all I'm saying, is that let's use the words that are in it here. We can use other words too. You know, like, look at COVID. We've gone from coronavirus to COVID. Now we've got Delta and Alpha. Yes, words matter, but we also have to use words that people understand.
And if those words become too loaded emotionally, and here I would be looking, you mentioned Orwell, the appendix to 1984, where he talks about thought crime and doublethink and how words can be used to get people to think.
I love that. I teach that very piece.
Yeah,
because it's fantastic.
Very important. Yeah. I mean, it's also worth knowing that Orwell at that time was informing on his own friends, and, you know, had got into a fairly dodgy place in his own life, unfortunately. Heroes fall. You know, it was the last year of his life. But that, you know, Margaret Singer used to say, if you want to understand mind control, start with the appendix to 1984. This remarkable way of showing how words can be used to deflect us from meaning. All I'm saying, I don't mind people using the word cult. They can use it as much as they like. But I'm saying that words, because they are living, as Orwell pointed out, the word egregious became useless when it came to have an opposite meaning. So it meant surpassing, and it came to mean shocking. Politics in the English language, I think, is the essay. So I think what I'm saying is that there are simple terms that we really do understand, that we don't have to elaborate upon. And when somebody takes your book and tries to make something antisocial out of it, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of society, that if you are to be good for society, for the greater community, you need to be pro-social or life-affirming, as Eric Fromm put it. And what people are doing, libertarians and others, right-wingers, outright, is taking your work, which is bringing a scientific, psychological perspective to the world, and perverting the use of it, so that it you know, becomes this, it becomes a tool for their thinking. And I can absolutely understand your irritation at that because it's the opposite. You know, from my reading of your book and from knowing you, it's the opposite.
They haven't read my book, because, you know, then they wouldn't use it. But anyway.
Yeah, they've grabbed some phrases to try and justify their argument, much the way that Hitler used Nietzsche with the editing of Elizabeth Nietzsche to change any passages that didn't support his lunatic ideology.
Just to move on a bit, because I see the times are ticking.
Times they are changing.
The other thing that we'd talked about discussing was, because I think we touched on prevention education, and just, you know, I think the universities need to start all having courses, full-length courses on this. But then the other thing was this phenomena that we're seeing so much of now, of the second and multi-generation people coming out of these cults, some of whom may have already been out a long time but not yet told their stories. And that's people who were born or raised in these groups. And
we have the I Got Out movement now in the US, gradually trying to, started by Mark Laxer, just encouraging people to tell their stories. Of course, in the Scientology world, there's a guy called Arnie Lerma who did very interesting work. And when I asked him for a puff piece for a new edition of Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, he said, before the internet and safety in numbers, there was John Atack, and which was very touching. But now there are thousands of ex-members because they believe they can have anonymity. That's not in fact true. You can trace them down, but
right, and a lot of them, and the way I see it, there's been this development from Lifton and Singer and Shine and that generation, and then various others. I'm not only, and then there were who weren't themselves in these systems, but who studied them, and then came kind of our generation who experienced them and told our stories. So yourself, myself, Steve Hassan, Jan Jelic, among others, and we then kind of try to get a scholarly or scientific view of these things. And now what I'm seeing is kind of another generation who have also used these materials because, we all build, knowledge builds on the prior knowledge as we, and they've used some of our work and other work and found each other and found networks and are starting to talk about what's happened to them. And there were some people who were born and raised early on talking about this, but much more isolated. And now, for instance, in the charity I work with, we're getting almost as many, if not more, people come to our support group who were born or raised, as opposed to people like me who were first generation. And it's really a kind of movement, is what I think is happening. Leo Rimini's work, all of that stuff is part of that.
Ex-Scientology Kids is the...
Yes, that's they've been around a long time. Yeah. So, and now there's a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses coming out who were born or raised, a lot of Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox Jews who are coming out, Exclusive Brethren kids, who grew up in these really isolated and crazy systems, whatever you want to call them. And,
crazy cults. I don't mind the word cult.
No, I know. I'm sort of teasing you. And, finding it very difficult, I think, to understand their experience, very difficult to understand our generation. Like, why did we do what we did? And then why did we do to our kids what, our generation did to the kids? There's a lot of difficult feelings. And then a lot of the things that we learned about recovery, finding our prior identity and the things we used to like, of course, is not relevant to that group because they didn't have a prior identity.
No.
So there's a whole new field of scholarship and work that is being done, and much more that needs to be done by and with that generation, those generations. And I just kind of want to say I have such admiration for those folks because I think their job is a lot more difficult than ours, than our generation. Some of them have come from 4 or 5 generations of cult membership. And then entering into this world that there's kind of no culture, it's like a foreigner landing on a strange shore, everything's kind of, they're just trying to acculturate oneself is phenomenally difficult. I mean, I found that difficult having missed 10 years. I came out of my group, I didn't know who David Bowie was or Queen, all these things that had happened. I think the Falklands War, which is why I asked you, I think that happened in the 80s.
Yeah.
I sort of maybe knew about it back here, but it didn't really happen. And there was all this catch up. But these young people, well, they're not all young now, have a whole lifetime, of not knowing what was really going on in the world. So it's a really remarkable adaptation that they have to make. with very few resources available, very few. You know, Janja Lalich just did that wonderful book, Escaping Utopia.
Great
That's a really, really good book, but we need so much more. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that because I think that's kind of the next step in this field, is to do a lot more work on that. So kind of prevention on the one hand of stopping other people getting in, and then working with these, you know, many, probably millions of people, really. I mean,
certainly not millions.
Yeah, so, and certainly many thousands coming out and trying to sort this stuff out. So I'm kind of heartened that there are so many now podcasts and books, memoirs coming out and so forth. But yeah, really important.
It is, and I mean, in the last couple of years, it's been the breakup of Nexium that's really caught the news, and Sarah Edmondson's Scarred is one of the best books I've read about occult experience, because I have a friend, Kapta Akhmedova, who's a professor of psychology, and when I first contacted her, it's because she'd got lots of people out of hospital in Chechnya who were suffering from a mass sociogenic illness and were having terrible physical symptoms. And I wanted to know about this story and got hold of her. And to my surprise, she'd read my book. It's like, what are you doing in Chechnya reading my book? And she said she found it very useful in dealing with people. And I didn't understand until a year or so later when I asked her for a little puff piece for the new edition. And she explained that the reason that she gave people my book, or pointed them towards it, was to show that even somebody who appeared to be intelligent could be taken in by this dreadful group. So it's a little bit of a backhanded compliment, but
sorry.
That's all right.
Strange noises coming through.
Strange noises off.
Yeah.
What seems to be happening in the last couple of years is a recognition that these behaviors and practices don't belong to my little group, that people are now realizing that, you know, as you and I realized many years ago, that human psychology is human psychology. And so people will, you know, in Amway or the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Sullivanians
or a battering relationship, you know, or a controlling personal relationship,
coercive relationships,
and the whole coercive control law that's now in place in England that we want to expand to include.
Absolutely, so that it's not just a matter of intimate partners, but anybody.
We are seeing, that, as you say, it's playing on fundamental human psychology for someone to get control over others against their own survival interests, for the predator's interests and against the subject's interests.
Yeah, years ago, I was talking with Daphne Vane, which we did all too infrequently, I think, because we really got on. And the question came up of where does the conditioning begin that makes people available to these groups? And Daphne said, it's in your mother's milk. And it was a real observation about, you know, the way that groupthink and obedience are aspects of human culture. And that, I mean, my friend Ori Chalef, his book, Intelligent Disobedience, that idea of going to 5-year-olds and right then saying, you can be intelligently disobedient. If you see something's wrong, you shouldn't just be going along with it. And so his blink, think, choice, voice, a class for 4-year-olds, to say, if somebody says something to you that doesn't sound right, blink and think, do I agree with that? And then you make the choice of whether you're going to voice that disagreement. And when I read that, looking back at my childhood, I sort of going, you know, what an oppressive environment school was.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
And so we have to, you know, that again is why I moved to the word authoritarian, to say that our society is authoritarian. And that means not that it's based upon expert authority, because as Michael Gove said, we've all had enough of experts. He has a plumber do his heart surgery. Who needs experts? So there is such a thing as expert authority, but that then gets confused with rank authority in our society. And authoritarianism is based upon somebody being the boss, somebody being the bully. And the behaviors that come out of that, which of course Hannah Arendt and others have spoken about with significant precision, the behaviors that are behind that are things that we can see. And I've become very enamored the last 3 years with the work of Erich Fromm.
Fantastic. Escape from Freedom was such an important book for me.
Yeah, for me too. Alan Shefflin recommended it about 5 years ago, and I find
it's the same school of thinking as Hannah Arendt. They were the same generation and same influences. It's hugely important work that has also somewhat been forgotten, but shouldn't be forgotten. Should be required reading.
The strange thing is that he sold millions of copies. He was a very popular author in the 50s and 60s. He gave us malignant narcissism as a concept in a book called The Heart of Man, which again is a wonderful book. There are certain aspects of his work which I find bothersome. For example, his presumption that homosexuality is a disease, which was the commonplace and was the into the 90s.
Nobody's perfect, No,
but it's good to say, not going to fall down in front of the man. There are a few little points, and that's a significant one. That he took the common attitude, the homophobic attitude.
That would have been a Freudian thing as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, his whole life he studied at the Berlin Institute of Psychoanalysis in 1929, and he is an exception in that most of the people who studied analysis, their doctorates were in medicine. His doctorate was in social psychology. And as soon as he arrived there, he started going, no, he's wrong about this. And eventually, his last book was Greatness and Limitation of Freud's Thought in 1980, when he was 80 years old. And he's gradually peeled away most of it, but he remained an analyst. But his humanitarian construction, the way he looks at who we are and how we should behave, seems to me so much better developed than anything else in psychology, that I don't see a simple statement of how we ought to behave, and how social beings ought to behave. And so I look at that and I look at sort of saying, well, we should be able to teach kids intelligent disobedience. I talked with Jessica Terviel, who's a counsellor in Holland last week, and she was talking about self-esteem and assertiveness. And she said that she believes, after 30 years in the counselling business, that assertiveness is self-esteem. That if you sidestep the ideas of self-worth, being able to say what it is you think, what it is you feel, and particularly what you desire and what you need with other people, that there's a conversation which can create secure attachments, which can create a strong society. And we're not not really much is being done about that.
Yeah, it can. There's a wonderful concept in that kind of, I think, came out of attachment work, and Peter Fonagy talks about it, of mentalization. I think I briefly talk about it in my book, which develops with secure attachment. And even if you're not securely attached as a child, you can earn secure attachment later in life if you have a relationship that's secure, where those qualities are happening, which are, by the way, openness, flexibility, responsiveness, which we can also ask for those in our society to have those qualities. But mentalization is, if I'm talking to you, I'm aware of what I'm feeling as I'm talking. And I'm also imagining your mind and what you're feeling and how you might respond to what I'm saying. And so and hope you might be doing the same, or you might not. But mentalization is that quality of being able to kind of engage with the mind of the other person. And I'm not quite saying it right, but you know how there's people who just on their own thing and they just not really engaging with you, or they're over engaging with you. They're not enough in their own mind. They're like, oh, I want to, kind of a bit intrusive. You know, someone like Trump is clearly not able to engage with anyone else's mind whatsoever. And I would argue that Joe Biden does engage with other people's minds, and as did Obama. I'm not saying that just because they're Democrats, but the way they speak and the way they engage with other people, they're thinking about the other person. You don't know what's in the other person's mind, so it's a little bit an act of imagination. But you're engaging with it, and you're having, you know, this kind of back and forth. And I find that a really useful concept, because it's about who we are is fundamentally about who we are with other people. We are nobody on our own. We couldn't survive on our own. We are, in fact, I do quote this in my book. I believe it's the principle of Ubuntu, which is a South African, I think it's Xhosa culture, which is, I'm going to misquote it again. But, you know, I am who I am because of the other people. You know, I exist in a community. And the problem with our modern Western worlds, which Eric Fromm explains beautifully, as does Arendt, is that we don't have those community structures now. We are very isolated and atomized. And it's at a crisis point, I would argue. You know, very few people have natural communities in which they kind of get their needs met. You know, we're kind of screwed. And getting increasingly so. And, you know, if I was running the Labour Party, I would say get into every constituency and start doing community organizing and get really serious about it. And create community structures where people meet each other and know each other and make friends with each other not in a cultic way, but in an open, flexible, and responsive manner. But let's form some community, because we are in grave danger without those structures, because then we can get picked off by these totalitarian groups, which is what's happening. We're seeing that. We see that in America, you know, really in a frightening way.
I was in Washington, D.C. more than 30 years ago, and had a lift from a Ghanaian taxi driver, and I said, "How long have you been in the US?" He said, 8 years. I said, "What's the main difference you notice?" And he said, "Well, back at home in my village, if anything went wrong in my life, the whole village was there to help me. In America, they have welfare."
Yeah, if you're lucky, they hardly have that.
Yeah, courtesy of Clinton.
And we don't have hardly any of it left here.
Yeah, it's got to the point where you cannot live on the money that's handed out. But there should be welfare. It is just that sense of creating community. And I think Robin Dunbar was probably about right when he said you can know 150 people.
Right.
And how do we establish those communities? Because we have all of these faux communities, which don't really do all that much. And there is so much that needs to be done. There's so much that can be done. And people will then organize in some way. My partner was saying she trained in person-centered therapy, and she was part of a center. And the most frustrating thing was that they'd have these meetings, which frankly, most of the people wouldn't attend. And she said it took 3 meetings to decide what kind of toilet roll they should be getting. that thing that goes off down that political route where everything is the choice of a committee, rather than having a more natural community and having people who get together to do something. I mean, watching the abject mess. Look at something like recycling, that the reality is that more than 50% of our recycled waste is dumped. And that's been the case since about 1982 when it started happening. At the moment, it's lining Turkey. It used to be sent off to China. Rather than dealing with this problem and looking at it and saying, this is something that could be dealt with at a community level, and that our structures are not functioning. They're not bringing people together to do something useful. People are going, oh, well, I put the paper in the recycling bin, therefore I'm a decent citizen. And it's how much more and how to become involved in doing something that's positive, something that's good.
And also something that is, because people do try and do this, and then they kind of wind up in these, quote, utopian communities that become cultic.
Yeah.
So, we have to have some ways to understand when is it starting to do that and closing off and becoming pure and all these danger signs. And when, so it's a very complex thing. And, I certainly don't have the answer, but I do think that's the question, of how do we organize ourselves, very much as you were saying, without it becoming cultic. And we have to tackle that problem. We have to start looking at that. And I'm sure cleverer people than me are. I hope they are,
Dominic Cummings.
Oh, stop it. On that rather grim note, I think I might have to go and feed myself some dinner.
Yeah, sounds like a good idea. It's been great talking with Alex. And thank you.
Wide-ranging conversation, John, as I fully expected from you, or with you.
It can happen. It can happen. So thanks, everybody, for watching. And we will have a list of Alex's books, which you should read, and hopefully some websites you can go to see some of the papers you've been writing. And I thoroughly recommend both of Alex's books, Inside Out and Terror, Love and Brainwashing. You will know things you did not know. I mean, you made me think about my involvement with Scientology, because you used the term total convert, and you talked about being isolated and engulfed.
That's
from Laughlin. And for the first time, I kind of looked at him and went, I was a true believer, but I wasn't a total convert, purely by luck, because I never was a living member. And so through 9 years, I did a thing with Leah Rimley the other week, and she was saying, you were traumatized by Scientology. And I said, no, I wasn't. Not until after I'd left. Yeah. And then they harassed me for 16 years. But I came to realize that this was extremely unusual, that almost anybody that gets involved with Scientology, they'll be bankrupted, their family will be split up, they'll be enslaved, what have you. It was a charmed life.
Maybe that's in a funny way why you were able to write the book.
Oh, I think so.
Fairly quickly, you probably and though I was a total convert in behavior, I don't want to make myself sound special because I wasn't, but I was rebellious. I was a bad member of the group. Not that rebellious, but I was grumpy and cross, and I was not a good soldier, though I aimed to be. But I think in a way that, as well as just my personality, like yours, I like to dig into things and, be sort of, scholarly about things. But the first book, I think I just wanted to tell this crazy story right away. It was just a drive to tell the fact and not the fiction that I'd been fed. I'm not quite sure if I'm connecting all those bits, but I think that total convert thing is important. And actually, in that respect, I was, in that my critical thinking was totally shut down. But it did come back very quickly, all of a sudden, which,
I mean, I'd come to believe total nonsense, and I was very fortunate because I came to the view that Ron Hubbard was no longer running Scientology. And so I was part of the mass exodus, about half the membership between 82 and 84. Found myself at the center of the so-called independent Scientology movement in the UK, basically protecting the people who wanted to deliver Scientology from the mother cult, which was attacking.
Yeah.
And within a few months, I was in this bizarre situation of not actually believing any of it anymore.
Yeah.
But I had not questioned it for 9 years, so I was a true believer.
Yeah.
But luckily, knowing the stories of, say, Mike Rinder, who, when I first interviewed him, he was 6 when his parents got in. He was 18 when he was sent over to Europe to join Ron Hubbard's flagship, where he was going to train in management. He got there, he was 18, his passport is taken away from him. He says, "When do I start the course?" And they say, we've swapped it. We're sending 2 people out to Australia to train your people. You now belong to us. And I kind of went to him, "So you're a slave?" And he went, "Yeah, exactly." And it's just seeing it in that simple perspective that once you've been pushed into that situation, he couldn't escape. And from there, went on to work directly with Hubbard, who was a little bit of a lunatic, according to would you ever imagine?
Well, I'll be damned.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I say for me, it was purely luck that I didn't, because I think the sleep deprivation, the rotten food, the bullying and shouting, I don't think I'd have resisted that. So it was luck. But my point is that I found your books useful, and I've read a lot of books about this. So if there's some material in there that's unique, then that's important. So,
and as I said, I found your book, A Piece of Blue Sky, the first edition, made a tremendous impression on me. I read it quite a long time ago. It was one of the early books, and I still think so. It's an amazing study and very helpful to me, having been in a group utterly different than Scientology, but yet totally the same, which is the great mystery and wonder of this whole field.
Yeah.
So it's a mutual fan club, John.
That's good enough.
All right.
Yeah. Great talking with you.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.